Welcome back, everyone. You know we love it when you send us sources, and you have really outdone yourselves this time. We've gotten so much great stuff from you lately.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Really fun to dive into.
And there's one in particular that really caught our eye. I think it might have been you that actually sent this one over.
Mm.
It's Ioana Vicuri's review article.
Oh, yeah.
What is the value of graphical displays in learning?
That's a great one.
Yeah, so we thought, well, this is perfect. Let's do a deep dive into this and really try to unpack, when and why those visuals we see all the time, charts, diagrams, maps, actually help us learn better, how they can help us get information faster and more effectively.
Yeah, and I think it's such an important topic, too, because we're just bombarded with information all the time now more than ever. So really understanding how to learn from visuals, I think, is key.
Absolutely. It's like having this extra tool in your learning toolkit. So to really get into this, we need to sort of start from the ground up. When we talk about these graphical displays, we're not talking about just any image, right?
Right, exactly. It's not just about looking at a pretty picture. We're
No.
talking about specific types of visuals that are designed to communicate information in a clear and concise way.
So what are we actually focusing on here?
Yeah, so the Curie draws on this idea from Bertin, who called these types of visuals monosemic systems.
Monosemic, okay.
And what that means is basically each part of the visual has a very specific, unambiguous meaning, and it's based on agreed upon rules. Like, think about a bar in a bar chart, right?
Yeah.
It always represents a certain quantity. And that's very different from what we would call polysemy images, like photographs or paintings,
Okay.
where the meaning can be much more open to interpretation. It depends on the viewer, their background, all of that.
Right, so we're not trying to interpret the Mona Lisa here.
Exactly, exactly. We're looking at things like diagrams, showing how something works, graphs representing data, obviously all sorts of maps, and network charts that show connections. And Vicuri actually references a really nice categorization by Lohse and others, I think it was from 1991, that kind of breaks down all these different types of graphical displays based on how we actually use and understand them.
So we're talking about those really clear, pre-designed visuals,
Yeah.
right, with specific meanings.
Yeah.
Not like the doodles you might make in the margins of your notebook.
Exactly, exactly. And that's really important to keep in mind because that's what all the research we're going to be talking about is based on.
Got it. So where do we even begin to untangle all of this?
Well, Vicuri starts with a really key theory, which is dual coding theory.
Okay, I've heard of that.
Yeah, and this was proposed by Alan Pivio back in 1990. And the basic idea is that we have two distinct but interconnected systems in our brains for processing information.
Two systems, like two channels.
Yeah, think of it like that. One deals with verbal information, so language,
Okay.
and the other with nonverbal information, primarily visual information.
Interesting. So what does that mean for how we actually learn?
Well, it's huge, right? Because when we learn something new, we're essentially creating these mental representations of it. And according to dual coding theory, we can do that using both verbal and visual channels.
Okay, so we're encoding the information in two different ways.
Exactly. And Pivio actually had specific terms for these units of information. He called the verbal units logogens, which are basically word-based codes.
Logogens.
Yeah, and then in the visual system, you have imagens, which are these mental image-like representations of objects and scenes.
Okay.
So when you encounter a new concept, let's say, you can form both a logogen for its name and an imagen for its visual appearance. And having these two representations makes it much more likely that you'll remember it later.
Because you have two different ways to access that information.
Exactly. And this is particularly important for more abstract concepts.
Oh, how so?
Because visuals can make abstract ideas more concrete. Think about something like, I don't know, democracy. It's a very abstract concept, but if you see a diagram of, say, the different branches of government and how they relate to each other, it suddenly becomes much easier to grasp.
Oh, that makes total sense. It's like giving your brain something concrete to latch onto.
Exactly. And Pivio's research actually found that people tend to remember concrete information much better than abstract information. So using visuals can really help bridge that gap.
So it's not just about having more information, it's about making that information more memorable.
Absolutely. And there's actually quite a bit of evidence from cognitive psychology and even neuroscience that supports this idea of distinct visual and verbal memory representations.
What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, for example, Pivio herself did tons of studies back in the 80s,
Yeah.
showing that people remember pictures better than words. And then there's also this really interesting finding called the additive effect.
Additive effect.
Yeah, it means that when words and pictures are presented together, and they're related to each other, of course, the memory for that information is often better than if you just saw the words alone or just the pictures alone.
It's like combining forces.
Exactly. It's like a 1 + 1 = 3 situation in terms of memory.
That's amazing. So seeing and hearing something together can lead to better remembering. What about this concept of mental imagery? How does that fit into all of this?
Right, yeah. Mental imagery is really at the heart of this visual system in dual coding theory.
Okay.
It's basically our ability to conjure up internal pictures of things, even when they're not physically present.
Right, like visualizing something.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about random images here. These mental images are thought to be generated from visual representation units that are stored in our long-term memory.
So they're based on our past experiences.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. And what's really fascinating is that the way we process these mental images is very similar to how we process actual physical images.
Really, how so?
Well, for instance, we can mentally manipulate them. We can zoom in on them, rotate them, all in our minds.
That's so cool.
Right. And the time it takes us to do these mental manipulations often mirrors the time it would take to do the same thing with real objects or pictures.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's almost as if our brain has this built-in visual simulator, right?
That's such a cool way to think about it. But I do remember, and I might be wrong about this, but wasn't there some debate about whether these mental images are actually a distinct type of representation or if they're just a byproduct of something else?
Yeah, you're right. There was a lot of back and forth about this, especially in the early days of cognitive science. There's a group of researchers called propositional theorists, and they argue that everything we experience, both visually and verbally, ultimately gets translated into a single underlying form of knowledge.
A single form, what does that mean?
They call these units of knowledge propositions. And you can think of propositions as these basic statements or facts.
Right.
So, according to this view, what we perceive as a mental image is actually constructed from these propositional units. It's not a fundamentally different kind of representation. It's just a different way of accessing the same underlying information.
So it's like it's all code underneath, just presented in different ways to our conscious awareness.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
But, while that's an interesting perspective, the more recent evidence from both psychology and neuroscience seems to point towards supporting the idea of distinct systems, at least within our working memory.
Distinct systems.
Yeah, so working memory is that short-term storage system that we use for actively processing information.
Right.
And there are models, like the one proposed by Alan Baddeley and Robert Logie, that include separate components for verbal information and visual and spatial information, all managed by a central executive.
Like specialized compartments for different types of data.
Exactly. And this is further supported by brain imaging studies that has shown that manipulating visual and spatial information actually activates different areas of the brain compared to manipulating verbal information.
So it's not just a theoretical concept. There's actual physical evidence in the brain itself.
Exactly. And the fact that perceiving a real image and imagining that same image seem to activate overlapping brain regions provides really strong evidence that there is some form of visual image-like representation happening in the brain.
It's like our brains don't really distinguish between what's real and what we're imagining.
Yeah, it's pretty wild when you think about it.
So, okay, dual coding theory. We have two distinct systems. And that can really enhance our learning by providing these multiple pathways to memory. But how does this actually translate into learning more effectively from, those graphical displays we started talking about? How do we apply all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And this is where the work of Richard Mayer and his colleagues and Sharon Derry and a lot of important contributions from Richard Reber come in. They really took this dual coding theory and ran with it, especially in the context of education.
Okay.
So Mayer's team specifically looked at how we could apply dual coding to the design of explanatory diagrams in science education.
Explanatory diagrams, so like those visuals that help us understand how things work.
Exactly, yeah, like, how a bicycle pump works or how a lightning storm develops, things like that.
Okay.
And their focus was on helping students build what we call coherent mental models.
Mental model, so like a mental representation of how something works.
Precisely. And Reber, on the other hand, focused more on younger students.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he was really interested in how we could use diagrams in computer-based instruction to help elementary school students grasp fundamental physics concepts, like Newton's laws of motion.
So taking this abstract idea of two systems in the brain, and actually putting it into practice in the classroom.
Exactly. And they came up with some really important design principles for how to create effective graphical displays based on this dual coding idea.
Okay, so what did they find? What makes a graphical display truly effective for learning?
Well, their research pointed to several key characteristics. And the first one, I think the most important one, is that the display needs to be aligned with the specific learning goal.
Aligned, what does that mean?
Well, if you're trying to teach students about cause and effect, the diagram should clearly show those cause and effect relationships.
Right.
It shouldn't just show the individual components in isolation. It needs to highlight those connections. And Reber's work actually showed that for processes that unfold over time, like, a plant growing or something, animated diagrams can be much more effective than static ones.
Animated, so showing the process as it happens.
Exactly, because that really helps convey that sense of movement and change. And another really important point, and this is especially relevant for anyone who's trying to learn from visuals, is that the visuals almost always need some kind of explanation or guidance.
You can't just throw a diagram at someone and expect them to understand it.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Learners often don't know where to focus their attention, right? They might misinterpret things if they're just left to figure it out on their own.
So it's like giving them the tools, but you also need to give them the instructions.
Exactly. And this can be done in so many different ways. You can have questions, prompts that direct attention to key features, interactive elements, all sorts of things that can really guide the learner's processing.
It's like having a tour guide for your visual.
Exactly. Yeah, I like that analogy.
So alignment with the learning goal, clear explanations. What else is important?
Okay, so another really key factor is what we call spatial and temporal contiguity.
Contiguity, that sounds complicated.
It's actually a very simple idea. It just means that the visual elements and the corresponding text should be close together in space and presented at roughly the same time.
Okay.
Like, if you're describing a particular part of a diagram, the text shouldn't be on a different page or screen, or even in a separate paragraph.
Right, it should be right there next to it.
Exactly, because when things are separated like that, our brains have to work much harder to make the connection between the visual and the verbal information.
It's like playing detective, trying to figure out what goes with what.
Exactly. And that extra effort can really overload our working memory and make it harder to learn.
So keep things close together.
Yeah. Ideally, the explanation should be right next to what it's explaining and ideally presented at the same time. And this is actually what Mayer called the contiguity
The
principle.
contiguity principle.
Yeah, it's a fundamental principle of multimedia learning that's based on dual coding theory. And then there's this really interesting finding called the modality effect.
The modality effect. Oh,
Yeah, and this was discovered by Mayer and Moreno. They found that presenting verbal information as auditory narration alongside a visual display can often be more effective than presenting the same information as on-screen text.
oh, that's interesting. So hearing the explanation rather than reading it.
Exactly. And the reason for this seems to be that our auditory and visual channels are processed somewhat independently in working memory. So when you use both, you're not overloading the visual channel in the same way that you would if you had both the visual and the verbal information competing for space on the screen.
Okay, so it's like spreading the information across different channels to reduce cognitive load.
Exactly. And this ties in really nicely with John Sweller's cognitive load theory.
Cognitive load theory, yeah, that's about how much information our brains can handle at once, right?
Exactly. And one of the key insights from cognitive load theory is that we should try to minimize what we call extraneous cognitive load.
Extraneous load, so like unnecessary mental effort.
Exactly. Anything that doesn't directly contribute to learning the material. And one way to do this is by designing materials that integrate the visual and verbal information in a way that reduces cognitive load, but also avoiding redundancy.
Redundancy, so like repeating the same information in multiple formats.
Exactly, yeah. Because that can actually increase cognitive load without adding any real value.
It's like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Yeah, exactly. Too much information at once can just overwhelm us.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot, right?
Yeah.
Providing the information in a clear and concise way, but not overwhelming the learner.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we also need to consider the learner themselves, right?
Right, because not all learners are created equal.
Exactly. And one of the most important factors is prior knowledge.
Prior knowledge, so what they already know about the subject.
Exactly. And this is where things get a little bit more complex.
Okay.
Because the research findings on how prior knowledge interacts with the effectiveness of visuals are somewhat mixed.
Mixed, how so?
Well, for instance, Mayer and Galini found that students with very little prior knowledge about, let's say, mechanical devices, seem to benefit more from having detailed diagrams than students who already had a good understanding of how those devices worked.
Okay.
However, Patricia Hegarty and her colleagues, who used eye tracking technology to see exactly where students were looking while they were learning, found a somewhat different pattern.
Eye tracking, that's fascinating. So they could actually see what parts of the visual the students were focusing on.
Exactly, yeah. And what they found was that readers with more prior knowledge actually process diagrams more strategically.
More strategically.
Yeah, they were better at quickly identifying the relevant parts of the diagram. And they could even infer information that wasn't explicitly shown in the diagram.
So they were kind of filling in the gaps based on their existing knowledge.
Exactly. Whereas readers with less prior knowledge tended to rely much more heavily on the accompanying text to try and make sense of the diagram.
It's almost like they needed that extra support to guide them through the visual.
Right. And so this raises the question, well, why this discrepancy in the findings?
Yeah. Why would some studies show that low-knowledge learners benefit more from diagrams, while others show that high-knowledge learners use them more effectively?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it probably has to do with a few different factors. Like one factor could be how prior knowledge is being assessed. Assessed. So how are they measuring what the students already know?
Exactly. Are they just looking at general background knowledge, or are they looking at very specific knowledge that's directly related to the content of the diagram?
Right, because those are two very different things.
Exactly. And another factor could be the complexity of the diagrams themselves.
The complexity.
Yeah, maybe there's a certain baseline level of prior knowledge that's needed just to even begin to interpret a diagram effectively.
Right, like you need some foundation to build on.
Exactly. But then once you reach a higher level of expertise, maybe the diagram isn't really providing that much new information anymore.
So it becomes less useful as you gain more knowledge.
Right. And another important learner characteristic to consider is spatial ability.
Spatial ability. So, like how good someone is at mentally manipulating shapes and understanding spatial relationships.
Exactly, yeah. And Mayer and Sims actually found that diagrams tend to have a less positive effect on students who have lower spatial ability. Oh, that's interesting. So for some learners, visuals might actually be more challenging to process.
Right, and their interpretation is that these students might have to expend more of their limited cognitive resources just on constructing a mental representation of the visual information in the first place.
Just trying to make sense of the visual itself.
Exactly, which leaves them with fewer resources available to actually connect that visual representation with the verbal explanations and integrate the new information.
So it's almost like they're hitting a cognitive bottleneck.
Right. Yeah, it's a really important consideration.
Mhm.
So while dual coding theory is incredibly valuable and it gives us a great framework for understanding how visuals can provide this alternative route to memory, it doesn't fully explain everything.
Right, there's still more to the story.
Exactly. It doesn't completely explain all the nuances of how we integrate verbal and visual information or how individual differences come into play.
A piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture.
Exactly. And that's why we need to look at other perspectives as well, like the visual argument hypothesis.
Okay, so let's shift gears then and talk about the visual argument hypothesis. What's the main idea behind this one?
So, the visual argument hypothesis suggests that graphics are effective because they can present information in a way that requires less cognitive effort to process than text.
Less effort.
Yeah, it's all about efficiency. Larkin and Simon called this perceptual enhancement,
Mm.
the idea that diagrams and maps and charts can present information in a way that's easier for our brains to directly perceive and make inferences from, compared to reading a long description.
So it's like the visual is doing through the cognitive work for us.
Exactly.
Okay, so what makes visuals so efficient in this way?
Well, Barbara-Tversky has argued that many of the conventions we use in graphics actually arise from biases in our visual perception.
Bias is like our brains are predisposed to interpret certain visual cues in certain ways.
Exactly, yeah. So, for example, we almost always use an upward direction to represent an increase in quantity.
Right, like a graph going up.
Exactly. And this actually mirrors not only our language, like we say prices are up, but even our physical experiences. Like we grow taller as we get older,
It's
right?
true, I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, and similarly, the way we use space to separate distinct ideas and group-related ones in visuals, it parallels how we structure language.
Okay, so it's like these visual conventions are tapping into something fundamental about how our brains are wired.
Exactly. And even something as simple as an arrow, which originally was used for hunting, has become a symbol for movement and direction in all sorts of graphics.
It's amazing how those basic visual cues can convey so much meaning.
It really is. And this
Yeah.
is what Larkin and Simon were getting at when they talked about the computational advantage of diagrams.
Computational advantage, so they're actually more efficient from a processing standpoint.
Exactly. They argue that diagrams can really improve the efficiency of information search, for example.
Okay.
When you're reading text, you have to go through it sequentially, right?
Yeah.
You have to hold pieces of information in your working memory while you're looking for the next relevant piece of information.
Yeah, it's like you have to keep track of everything as you go.
Exactly. But diagrams, because they organize information spatially, they make it much easier to locate what you need. It's all laid out in front of you.
So you don't have to hold as much in your working memory.
Exactly. And they also talked about the power of what they call perceptual inferences.
Perceptual inferences, what are those?
So that's our ability to basically extract information and make connections just by looking at the visual arrangement without having to really consciously interpret every single element.
It's like our brains are making those connections automatically.
Exactly. Like in a bar graph, you can instantly see which bar is bigger and which one is smaller. You don't have to think about it.
Right, it's just obvious.
Exactly. And more recent work by people like Mike Scaife, Yvonne Rogers, and Jing Zhang has explored this idea of visual displays as a form of external cognition.
External cognition, so we're kind of offloading some of our thinking onto the visual itself.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like we can interact with and manipulate parts of the visual representation to help us solve problems or arrive at new understandings.
It's a tool that's actively helping us think.
Exactly. So what kind of evidence supports this idea?
Yeah, that's a good question. What research has been done on the visual argument hypothesis?
Well, a lot of the research in this area has focused on the effectiveness of what we call graphic organizers.
Graphic organizers, okay.
Yeah, things like mind maps, concept maps, diagrams, things like that. And they basically use spatial arrangements to visually represent how different ideas and concepts are connected to each other.
Okay.
And the big question has been, how do these graphic organizers compare to just reading plain text when it comes to understanding complex relationships?
Right, because that's really what it's all about, understanding how things connect.
Exactly. And early research back in the, 80s and early 90s actually produced some mixed results.
Mixed results, so some studies showed benefits, others didn't.
Exactly, yeah. But more recent studies, especially those by Daniel Robinson and his colleagues, have provided much clearer insights.
And what did they find?
Well, what they found was that graphic organizers might be just as effective as plain text for just recalling basic facts. But where they really shine is when it comes to understanding more complex inferences and integrating different pieces of information together.
So it's not just about memorizing isolated facts, it's about seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly. And one type of graphic organizer that they found to be particularly effective is what we call a matrix.
A matrix. So
Yeah, and a matrix is basically a visual representation that can show multiple relationships between different categories of information all at once.
Okay.
And they found that matrices were often more effective than traditional linear outlines for identifying patterns, integrating new concepts, especially in more realistic learning scenarios.
Realistic scenarios, what do you mean by that?
Well, like when students have to study longer texts and they have more time to really engage with the material, that's when the benefits of matrices become more apparent.
So it's not just about a quick 5-minute study session. It's about deeper learning.
Exactly. And this really highlights the importance of how the display is designed.
The design of the graphic organizer itself.
Yeah, because it's not just about presenting the information in a visual format. It's about how that specific visual structure actually guides our understanding of the connections between ideas.
The design itself is part of the argument.
Exactly. And there's actually research to support this. Petra Wigman and her team found that knowledge maps, which are a type of graphic organizer that were designed following Gestalt principles of visual organization, were much more effective for learning than maps that lacked this clear structure.
Gestalt principles, those are those principles of perception that we were talking about earlier, right?
Exactly, yeah. Like using proximity to group-related ideas together, using visual hierarchy to highlight important concepts, things like that.
So it's about using the visual design to make those underlying relationships more obvious.
Precisely. And similarly, Philip Beckinson and his colleagues found that using matrices that didn't organize information into meaningful clusters didn't really offer any advantage over outlines or just reading plain text.
So a poorly designed visual can actually be just as unhelpful as no visual at all.
Right. And what about how we actually search for information using graphics? Does the visual structure make that easier?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, again, the visual argument hypothesis would predict that well-designed graphics should facilitate more efficient information search.
More efficient. Okay.
Yeah, and there's research to support this as well. William Wynn and his colleagues found that using tree diagrams significantly reduced the amount of time it took students to solve complex problems compared to using lists of written statements.
Tree diagrams, so those hierarchical diagrams that branch out.
Exactly, yeah. And the idea is that that hierarchical visual structure made it easier for students to locate and relate the necessary information.
It's like having a visual map of the information.
Exactly. And Daniel Robinson and Thomas Skinner found similar benefits with matrices. Students could locate specific concepts and compare information across different categories much faster when it was presented in a matrix compared to an outline.
So it's not just about understanding relationships, it's also about finding specific information more quickly.
Exactly. But it's important to note that not all interpretation tasks are equally easy with graphics.
Okay, so there are limits to this visual efficiency.
Right. Ann O'Donnell and John Guthrie and their colleagues actually found that while graphics can be really helpful for locating specific facts or identifying data points, more complex cognitive tasks that require interpreting overall relationships, identifying trends, and understanding underlying patterns were not always significantly easier with graphics compared to text.
So sometimes the visual might not be as helpful for those higher level thinking skills.
Exactly. It's like, the visual might help us see the individual trees, but not necessarily understand the layout of the whole forest.
Right.
But more recent research by Annalise Shaw and Patricia Carpenter and others suggests that even for those more complex tasks, if graphics are designed really thoughtfully, they can significantly improve performance.
So it comes back to the design again.
Exactly. What they found was that when graphs are designed based on principles of visual perception, they can actually allow viewers to rely more on automatic pattern recognition processes, which reduces the need for conscious cognitive effort.
So it's like the visual is guiding our brains to see those patterns more easily.
Exactly. And different types of graphs are better for different types of tasks.
Okay.
Like line graphs are really effective for showing trends over time because the connected line is perceived as a single visual unit.
Right, it's like you're seeing the flow of the data.
Exactly. Whereas bar graphs are better at facilitating comparisons between discrete categories because the bars are typically placed in close proximity to each other.
It's like they're inviting you to compare them.
Exactly. And then, of course, we also need to consider the role of prior knowledge in all of this.
Right, because that always comes into play.
Exactly. Ann O'Donnell's work actually found that students who had higher levels of prior knowledge were generally more successful at retrieving information from knowledge maps, not just for simple factual recall, but also for making more complex inferences.
So the more you know, the more you can get out of the visual.
Exactly. And this suggests that having some existing framework of knowledge can really help you leverage the efficiency that visuals can provide.
It's like you have a mental scaffolding to hang the new information on.
Precisely. So we've seen how the visual argument hypothesis can help us understand why visuals are so effective, how they tap into our perceptual biases and reduce cognitive load. But there's one more perspective that we need to consider, which is the conjoint retention hypothesis.
Conjoint retention. Okay, what's that one all about?
So this hypothesis was developed by Raymond Kulhavi and his colleagues, and it's basically an application of dual coding theory, specifically to learning from maps.
Maps, okay.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it brings together elements of both dual coding and the visual argument hypothesis.
So it's kind of like a bridge between those two ideas.
Exactly. And the main goal of this hypothesis is to explain why and how studying maps, like geographical maps, can be particularly beneficial for learning information from accompanying text.
So like when you have a map and a text description that go together.
Exactly, yeah. And it's based on two main assumptions.
Okay, what are those?
The first assumption, which comes straight from dual coding theory, is that we create separate but connected memory codes for both the verbal information we read in the text and the visual information we take in from the map.
So two different channels again.
Exactly. And the idea is that the map creates this visual memory trace that can later help us remember details from the text.
It's like an anchor for the verbal information.
Precisely. And the second assumption, which they call the computational assumption, builds on Larkin and Simon's work on the efficiency of visual representations. It says that when we encode a map into memory, We preserve its key visuospatial properties.
Visual spatial properties, so not just the individual features on the map, but also the spatial relationships between them.
Exactly. The idea is that we're encoding the map as this whole integrated unit, which then makes it easier to retrieve later.
It's like we're taking a mental snapshot of the map.
Exactly. And because we're storing those spatial relationships, it doesn't put as much strain on our working memory as trying to piece together a spatial understanding from just a verbal description.
Makes sense. So what does the research show about this conjoint retention idea? Does it actually work?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of evidence to support it. Clavy and his team conducted numerous studies using both reference maps, which show geographical locations, and thematic maps, which display things like population density or rainfall patterns. And what they found consistently was that students who studied a map, in addition to reading a text passage, remembered significantly more information from the text compared to students who just used non-visual study aids.
So the map was actually making a difference.
Exactly. And this was true even when the non-visual study aids were things like taking notes or underlining, which are often considered pretty effective.
So it wasn't just about having something extra to do, it was specifically about the visual nature of the map.
Right. And they also found support for that second assumption, the computational assumption.